Hey everybody, good afternoon. My name is Nick Meller. I'm a board member with the Sacramento Press Club, and we're here again to join you for lunch with another exciting panel. Today we have Congresswoman Karen Bass. She represents the 37th district, which includes the city of Los Angeles, Inglewood, Culver City, and we're grateful to have her join us today at lunch. We also have three moderators joining us today. We have George Skelton. George is a state political columnist at the LA Times. He's covered state politics and national politics since Pat Brown was governor, and he followed Governor Ronald Reagan to Washington to cover him as well. George, thanks for joining us today. We also have Joe Garofoli from the San Francisco Chronicle. He's a senior political writer, and he's also host of the It's All Political podcast. We also have Seema Mehta. She's a political reporter with the LA Times, and if you want to follow her on Twitter, you can do that at LATSeema, S-E-E-M-A. Everyone, we're so grateful to have you today, and I'm going to pass the baton to George. But first, I want to give a shout out to our sponsor, which is Southern California Edison. They make this panel possible today, so thank you, Southern California Edison. George, have at it.
Well, Congresswoman, welcome back to Sacramento. Although
Thank you.
You're not in Sacramento, but so let me get right to the question on everybody's mind. How important is it politically and for the country that Biden choose a woman of color as his running mate?
I think it's very important. I mean, first of all, I think the vice president should choose who he wants. No one knows better than him, having served as vice president. But I think that it would be very important, especially at this particular moment in our country, where unfortunately race, I think good side, race is a important issue, but we have a president that has been so divisive and has used race regularly, especially whenever he's in a hot spot.
So do you wake up in the morning ever and or go to sleep at night envisioning yourself debating Mike Pence and thinking up some nice zingers that you wouldn't mind sharing with us?
I don't go to bed or wake up thinking about Mike Pence.
How do you think you'd do in a debate with him?
I think if I had to debate him, I would debate him. I mean, I think that he has to stand on the record of this administration. And every day, multiple times a day, I think of 138,000 Americans that are dead. And I don't believe they all had to die. But because of the way the president has handled this pandemic, and frankly, you remember for a while, although we know it changes every few weeks, for a while, the vice president, Pence, was in charge of how this pandemic was handled. But he has, 3.5 years to answer for.
Between your experiences in LA and then in Sacramento and then in DC, what would you bring to a Biden Bass ticket?
Well, and you know that when it comes to the questions around vice president, you can reference, you can have those questions go to a campaign. But let me just tell you that about myself, having spent many, many years doing grassroots organizing as an activist, working in the progressive movement for decades before I ever thought about running for office, I think one of the things that is needed right now is a bridge. So many bridges. First of all, we need a bridge within the Democratic Party to bring all sides of the party together. And so I had the honor of working on one of the task forces on the economy, where I co-chaired, and then there was a representatives from Sanders, Sarah Nelson, who is the president of the Flight Attendants Union. We worked together to craft a paper on the economy. So building bridges, bringing people together within the Democratic Party, building bridges, bringing people together across racial lines, and then building bridges across both sides of the aisle. And that's something that I have done in the 16 years that I've been in office. And I'm looking forward to this week coming up to introduce a bipartisan piece of legislation on criminal justice reform.
And what does it say about, people of color and women have been so underrepresented in whether it's our state houses, whether it's Congress, whether it's our governor's mansions. What does it say about the fact that, that we have this field of women of color, so many people, like I could count on two hands that Joe Biden is considering? I mean, did you think we would come to a point in politics where there was, this many people?
Oh, absolutely. In terms of there being this many people, very much so. But let me just tell you that I was in South Carolina during that debate when he announced that he was going to put a woman on the ticket. And we all jumped up. We were just thrilled. And I think if you look at the women, there are just so many talented women of color, women who are white. The talent that is there has always been there. And women have always been there. Sometimes we don't get elected to office, but one thing we always do is the work.
Congresswoman, on that Unity Task Force, one place where Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders disagree on is the legalization of cannabis. Do you think that Joe Biden should support the federal legalization of cannabis?
I don't necessarily think that he should. I think, just in terms of my own opinion about that, what I do think the federal government should do is stay out of the states. In other words, where states have legalized it, I don't think the federal government should supersede that. A couple of other things that have been raised in Congress that we voted on is banking. I think that's a real problem, that these businesses have to be a cash-run business. I have a friend who lost her son in one of those businesses where there was a robbery that took place and he was shot and killed. As long as they're cash businesses, that makes them very dangerous. The other place that I think the federal government needs to be in research and funding drug treatment. For 15 years, I ran an organization in South Central Los Angeles that focused on substance abuse prevention. So this is an issue I've been involved with for a long time, and I have long felt that addiction is a very serious problem. And what we have tended to do in some of our communities is we've criminalized a health problem. Now that opioid addiction is here and different population is using opioid than crack, we're not criminalizing it. And so we need to have massive funding in drug treatment.
Well, why not, wouldn't legalizing cannabis at the federal level sort of take away some of those issues, particularly the banking issue?
Well, no, I'm not sure if that takes it away. It might, but we had specific legislation on banking that I supported. In terms of whether or not the federal government just has a wholesale policy on legalization, I'm not sure that is necessary, but the states now, and I don't know how many states, maybe you do, how many states have voted to legalize. California, I think we led the way with that, not in legalization, but in medical marijuana. I believe we were the first state that did that. But, I also don't think it's a panacea. I think you can have problems with marijuana. And I don't like the way it is just put out there as though there's no problems at all. The other thing that I don't buy, now, if I'm wrong, data will prove me different and I'll wait to see. Just because it's legalized in California, I don't automatically believe that means that the disproportionate arrest rate is going to stop. And I remember the day it went legal in Los Angeles, in California, right down the street from where I live, the police set up a stop point. And I know I've had many conversations with young African Americans and Latinos telling them, just because it's legal, don't think that you can't get arrested. So if you smoke a joint before you leave your house and you get stopped and the officer smells that in your car, that can be a DUI. So I think that part of the legalization movement is selling something that I don't believe is accurate to communities of color. That the reason why we need to legalize it is to address the disproportionate arrest and incarceration rate. Now, I'm happy to say I'm wrong within a few years if data proves me wrong, but I'm suspicious of that.
I'm speaking about law enforcement and race. I mean, obviously that's been such a huge crisis in this nation for a long time. And it seems like it's intersected your life. When you were volunteering for RFK, when you're a community organizer in South LA during the Rodney King verdict and the arrest afterwards, and now with your leadership on the police reform bill. Do you feel like anything has actually changed? Like, are we substantively moving forward as a nation? And I mean, could you just reflect on your experiences over the years?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, when I went to George Floyd's memorial service in Houston, and you might have heard me say this before, but I looked up at his picture and I saw he was born in 1973. Well, that was the year I got involved in this issue. I joined an organization in Los Angeles called the Coalition Against Police Abuse. And I bet George remembers our infamous police chief, Daryl Gates, who we were fighting him in 1973. I was fighting him in 1993. It took us changing the city charter to fire him. And so I think things are different. And let me tell you the most important way. And all of these killings that we've seen, especially since the invention of the cell phone camera, every time they would poll the country, and white Americans would say 70%, I'm just making up the numbers, I don't remember exactly what it was. 70% of Americans say that there is no systemic problem with policing. This is just a one-off. 70% of Black Americans say there is a problem with policing in the United States. After George Floyd, because it was so egregious, 70% of Americans, Black, white, and of every color, say there's a problem now. That is a profound change. And the protests that are happening in the streets, every state in the country, countries around the world, all 54 African nations went before the UN and complained about policing in America. That is a seismic shift. The fact that the George Floyd bill was supported by 100% of the Democrats, people might take that for granted. I don't. I think if that bill had been put up before George Floyd's horrific murder, I don't think all the Democrats would have supported that bill. And 3 Republicans that voted on it, even after 2 days after Trump tweeted, when he tweets, everybody then does what they're told to do. And they didn't, they broke rank. And ever since we've introduced that bill, I've been in conversation with my Republican colleagues who are telling me, well, we think this is good. We think this is good. We have problems with that. That to me represents a seismic shift.
Do you think it has a chance of getting out of the Senate?
I do. And we will see. I am in discussions. There's no formal negotiations going on. Our focus is on pressuring the Senate to take up the bill, but we are also in discussions with Republicans in the House to see what they might be willing to support. You have to have plan A, B, C, and D, right?
So what worries, Congresswoman? Yeah, what worries you most about a second term for Trump?
Oh my God, 138,000 dead Americans today, and he doesn't seem to care. I don't know if he knows a name. He doesn't even mention them. He wants us to congratulate him because there's not more people. So anytime you have a leader who is in the middle of a pandemic, who refuses to acknowledge, he thinks he can just adopt magical thinking and it's going to go away, or we're just going to expose everybody with herd immunity, and then we're just going to have to accept the fact that a lot of people are going to die. So what worries me the worst is, or worries me the most is the pandemic. And then to me, there is no separating the pandemic from the economy. So I would worry that we'll be in a wholesale depression if he were to be president. And then of course the courts. I mean, I could go on and on. I'll stop here.
Is there anything about the administration's decision to take down the CDC data today?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Sorry. Is there anything that can be done in Congress about the administration's decision to take down the CDC data on hospitalizations and ICU?
No, because this administration is a lawless administration. I mean, we can pass bills, we can allocate money. The administration decides whether or not they're going to follow the rules. So, I don't know. I mean, what can be done will be done in 100 and how many days do we have? 118 days? That's what can be done.
Congresswoman, you alluded earlier to you being a bridge across the Democratic Party. We've seen poll after poll show that progressives, especially young people, are less than enthused, to be kind, about Joe Biden. What can you do to get young progressives excited about Joe Biden? Someone who they see is out of touch in many ways.
Organizing and activism. I mean, I have worked with young folks for the last 30 years. When I started Community Coalition in 1990, We built a youth component, and I recruited high school students and got them involved. Some of those folks are still there at Community Coalition. They're now in their 40s. But I believe going out and talking to people. Now, the thing that's going to be so challenging is that what kind of campaign are we going to have? If
Exactly. How do you talk to people when there's, you can't talk to people?
If it's going to be a campaign like this, I mean, we're going to have to use every tool possible, every tool. And one thing about young folks is that they're more adept at these tools, right? I mean, you campaign on your telephone. But I know one thing that I would be willing to do is to go out. I will go out safely. I will go out with my mask. I will wear my gloves. I will do whatever it takes because I really view this election as a survival election. And talking to young folks and telling them this is what's at stake. The next 2 generations really are at stake because of the courts. And you know that they are systematically appointing 40-year-olds to the courts so that they'll be there for the next 40 years. So it's about it's about their lives. It's also about their children and their grandchildren's life. But it's also about our very existence, because if he had another term, I just don't know what would happen to us. We already lack so much credibility in the world. I think if Biden had been president at the beginning of the pandemic, what I believe Biden would have done is the same thing Obama-Biden did during Ebola. Ebola could have been a pandemic, but because of the standing that Obama had in the world, he galvanized the world, and that pandemic, or that problem, Ebola, was kept to 3 countries in Africa. It didn't even spread through the continent. 2 Americans died. I think that we would have had a better relationship with China, that he could have galvanized the world around China. Now, I'm not saying we wouldn't have had a pandemic, but I don't believe any way, shape, and form 138,000 Americans needed to die.
But what specifically about Joe Biden and his policies can you get young progressives excited about? That's less of a counterfactual, but.
Well, I mean, let me just use what his speech yesterday on the environment, on climate change. I mean, I think that there were a lot of things that he said in climate that would excite young people. I also think what he said around race and policing would excite young people. I think that people need to know more about his policies. And then I think that different messengers need to communicate that. And I think that's the case really no matter who would be on the ticket. You need young people communicating to young people. You need those influencers, a term we didn't even really have before, Instagram and social media. The way I have always worked with young people, I don't tell them what to do. I bring them to the table. I ask them, what do they need? And then it's my job to give them resources to do what they need to do best. Who do they want to hear from? Do you know about Biden's policies on X, Y, and Z? Well, who would communicate that to you? I don't think I'm I'm more than willing to do the communication, but I don't think I'm the communicator.
What's his biggest danger going into November?
What's Biden's biggest danger?
Yeah, right.
Oh, I think
what could really trip him up?
Well, I think of 2 things. One, this way of communicating, because I think one thing about Biden and one thing that has always attracted me to him is his authenticity, is the fact that I believe he sincerely cares about people. Now, it's tough to demonstrate that in COVID, you know what I mean? Because you got to stay 6 feet away from me. So I think the inability for him to really be able to be his true authentic self because of the pandemic, I think is a limitation. The other thing, and I think really the most important thing about this election, is voter suppression and the way the Republicans are going about voter suppression this time, which is using COVID. So what happened in Kentucky, that was an embarrassment in the world. Do you remember those people banging on the window because they wanted to get ballots? Reducing the places where people can vote, making people risk their lives to vote because voting at home, they're saying now is some evil, even though it was always the Republican strategy. As a matter of fact, Democrats weren't very good at it. It's the way I won my first election, by the way. I had a vote by mail strategy. And so I think that those are the things that can trip him up more than anything.
But we saw what happened in Kentucky. We saw what happened in Wisconsin earlier this year.
Right.
I feel like the Democrats or the campaign are aggressively trying to get in front of this? Or is it another case where we'll see these news reports and people will sort of lament what happened?
No, that's another thing that's frustrating. We are so lucky that we live in California because some of these problems we don't have. I mean, we might have had, like in LA County, for example, we had a lot of problems with our election, but it was more about competency. It wasn't voter suppression. I mean, we decided to change our voting system in a presidential year, which one should debate whether we should have done that. But in these other states, and in particular, states like the South, I worry that they will resort to anything to stop people from voting. Now, I work in foreign policy. I travel the world talking about US democracy and how people need to be free to vote. And look at this. The world knows that we have one party that doesn't want people to vote, that wants to limit who votes. I really think that's the greatest danger. So when you ask Seaman, I'm sorry I didn't directly answer this, I think that we are doing the best we can in terms of putting money into the election system. But that doesn't mean they're going to use the money the right way. Even if you give the money to Mississippi, do you think Mississippi is going to use the money to expand the voting rights of Black people? We passed the Voting Rights Act in the House. It's languishing over in the Senate. So I think when your government doesn't work, then I think you have to resort to grassroots organizing. And I do believe that is going on. And I know I'm talking to foundations and individual donors saying, please give money, not even to California, give money to Mississippi, give money to Alabama, give money to these other states, the swing states especially.
Is it too late to prepare for the change in the way we're going to be voting at this point? Or do we still have time to do this? California may be ahead of the game, but a lot of these other states may not be. Is it too late?
No, it's not too late, but we really are running out of time. It isn't too late. I mean, I was listening to, might have been the governor of Oregon talking about their system there. Their system is very secure, more secure than if they voted in person. So let me add to voter suppression, Russian intervention, which I believe is a form of voter suppression as well.
We have a question from the audience.
Oh, sure.
And someone asks, what do you think of Trump's repeated attacks on journalists? Are they harming the public?
Yeah, to me, it's an attack on democracy. It's an attack on democracy. It's an attack on our system. Again, it's one of those things I run around the world preaching, right? Freedom of the press. The press needs to be critical of governments. I mean, I work in Africa. And so seeing the democratic space shrink in some African countries, and one of the things, by the way, and this is being used in different countries around the world, which is using COVID to shrink the democratic space. Well, maybe we don't need to have our election right now because we can't keep it safe. The press really shouldn't criticize my government right now because that makes us, so using COVID to further shrink the democratic space. It's a problem.
Congresswoman, I've got a question I want to ask. Many of your critics, you don't have many critics, but the few critics you have, talk about the praise you gave Castro when he died. You called him Commandant in Chief and said that he would be a big loss to the Cuban people. What were you trying to say there? Were you trying to praise this commie dictator or what?
No, I was definitely not trying to praise the commie dictator. What I was doing was really, an expression of a country that lost its leader, controversial, a leader that has always been at odds in the United States, that we have viewed as reducing or not allowing freedom of speech, elections, travel. As a matter of fact, I sit on the board of NED, the National Endowment for Democracy, and that organization funds the activities in Cuba to increase the democratic space. I have always been supportive of the Cuban people, And I've also always believed in terms of our policies toward Cuba, and not just Cuba, but other countries, that if we really want to bring about change in those countries, one of the best ways to do that is to have communication, dialogue, and open relations. And I was very happy when Obama opened up relations, not just from the point of view of relations between our two countries, but also opening up trade. Because the best way to influence what is happening in a country is for us to have a dialogue and communication. And that's all that I was saying. Now, having said that, and talking to my colleagues from Florida, who certainly schooled me on the sensitivity of that, I understand where they were coming from.
We have another question from if Vice President Biden is elected, should he only serve one term? And if so, should he announce that before the election?
Absolutely not. I don't think he should come in and say, I'm only serving one term. If he did that, that would immediately reduce him to lame duck status. And I think that that would be wrong. I think that President Biden, I'm going to declare it, should serve as long as he chooses to serve. And assuming that he would get reelected, that's what he should do.
Congresswoman, one sad commonality that you have with President Biden, you almost got me saying it, former Vice President Biden, is that you both lost a child. How did that reshape you as a person, which is unimaginable, and also as a legislator?
Well, it does, and it was two children, because I also lost my son-in-law as well in the same accident. And you know, that it changes your life. I mean, I remember the last time I saw my daughter, I took her to lunch. We were celebrating that she was getting ready to do an internship in a law firm because she wanted to be a lawyer. And who knew, you know, and then you don't see the person again, that's it. And it was a traumatic loss, just like his loss was traumatic. But one of the things that really hit me about him, and it really impacted me in a strong way, I'll never forget it, when he was accepting the nomination as vice president. George will remember this as well, because I was speaker and California had run out of money. And so I couldn't go to the convention, and I was watching his acceptance on TV. And before he spoke, they played a video and it talked about the accident. And I just kind of sunk in my chair, because my kids had died 2 years before, and his wife and daughter had died decades before. And it just hit me that I was going to be forever, that was forever going to be a part of my narrative. And I was really struggling at that point, because I was trying to be the Speaker of the House, still seriously grieving. And oftentimes I would get up to give a speech, and in the introduction, people would talk about my loss. And it was like, great, now how do I get up and give a speech after that? So it just made me, one of these days I would love to have an in-depth conversation about how he went on, because I know he questioned whether or not to be sworn into the Senate, whether or not to serve. And he made a decision to move ahead. And one day I hope to have that conversation with him.
Speaking of California, how are things different in Washington than they are in California as far as legislating?
Well, you know, when I was there, I could only serve 3 terms, so it was 6 years. So you couldn't be a long-term strategic thinker. And then 5 out of the 6 years I was there, we were in an economic crisis. So one of the things that I love about DC is that, one, I get to do domestic and international work, but 2, there's so much institutional memory and knowledge around. So you don't feel like it's rookies running the institution, which is what California felt like at the time. Now, you know, of course, we've changed now, and it's 12-year terms, which is much, much better. But like when I got to Washington and I wanted to work on foster care in Africa, I just went around and found the members of Congress that were experts in those areas, and I hitched my wagon to them and they showed me the way. And so you can be a long-term strategic thinker in Congress, where during my years, you couldn't do that in Sacramento.
It looks like if the polling holds, it looks like there's a real chance that Democrats can retake the Senate and take the White House. And if so, what should the party's top priorities be for legislating?
Healthcare. It's got to be healthcare. I mean, in the middle of a pandemic, we have a president that wants to eliminate the Affordable Care Act. So, unfortunately, the damage that has been done to the Affordable Care Act over these years, we number one have to patch it back together, and then we need to build on it and expand. And I think healthcare, jobs, those absolutely have to be the top priorities. I mean, just think, who knows what state our economy will be in? I just hope that we're not in a depression.
How do you get along with Kevin McCarthy? I mean, he was one of your, wasn't he a seatmate, or he sat near you or something like
No,
that?
he was
in the assembly.
Yes, he was Republican leader when I was majority whip. And Kevin and I were friends in Sacramento. We were friends in DC. We talked to each other, sometimes on the record, sometimes off the record. We've traveled the world together. So we're friends.
We have a question from the audience, and someone asks, given how President Trump has disturbed a lot of established norms, do you think there should be any changes to the Constitution after he leaves office?
Well, I don't know about the Constitution, but I bet you're going to see a flurry of laws that happen, just like after Nixon left. And I think one of them will be, if you're going to run for president, you have to show us your taxes. How about if you're going to run for president, you need to show us a complete health exam, which is physical and mental. I think what Trump has shown us is that we have some weaknesses in our system. So we have all sorts of laws, but what we don't really have is an ability to enforce those laws if you have a president that is lawless. And what I believe about the Republican Party is I believe it's been seized by an extremist element, and that they need to take their party back. I've been very interested watching the Lincoln Project, and I went on their webinar. I actually went and signed up. I watched their webinar, and to see a group of Republicans talking about how they want the Democrats to take back the Senate, they want Biden to win. And I think that that's a responsible thing to do. And then maybe after we take back the government, maybe then they can go take their party back.
Thomas Friedman recently proposed that Biden shouldn't debate Trump unless he shows his taxes. Do you think he should? Do you think that's a good idea?
I don't know if he should. I do think it's a question as to whether or not he should debate Trump, just because how productive is that going to be? What is that going to show? You know what I mean?
What about the blowback? Then some people might say, well, Biden's afraid of the confrontation.
Yeah. I mean,
is it worth it?
Well, I mean, I think that it would be important to maintain the tradition of presidential debates, but I will question what value it will really have. So I could see maintaining it for the tradition, but beyond that, I just don't even know the value of, and I say that because rarely what comes out of his mouth is true. So he's going to say anything. He doesn't care whether or not the fact checkers say that he's lying. He will lie in the same sentence. I mean, he will tell different things in the same sentence. So that's why I question the value of it, but there is value in maintaining the tradition.
You were against defunding the police, which Willie Brown says is one of the worst slogans ever concocted politically.
Oh.
But why is that? What's your thinking on that?
Well, here's what I do believe. I do believe that over the years, we have essentially dumped social, health, and economic problems on the police to clean up. And that what we should do as a society, instead of talking about defunding, I would talk about refunding. Why don't we refund the cities to take care of health, social, and economic problems? So when I started Community Coalition 30 years ago at the height of the crack epidemic and at the height of the gang problems, I did that because I felt that crack was a health issue and we were criminalizing it, and that drug dealing was an economic issue because industry had left. And then we were fighting to maintain resources. At the time, the words we used were different. We talked about devolution. Devolution was just a fancy word that said the federal government was going to cut programs. And in Los Angeles, for example, you know, and Sacramento, there's a terrible problem with homelessness. Why should the police have to deal with that? That is a health, a social, and an economic issue. So I think that resources need to be reprioritized. And in Los Angeles, our mayor is shifting funding away from police toward dealing with some of the issues of neighborhood violence and also homelessness.
If you're in Sacramento, though, with a big deficit, how do you spend money on that and find other things to cut? How do you balance the budget, which you don't have to do in Washington?
Right. That's absolutely correct. And you know what? So here's what I believe. It's my responsibility to fight in DC to send the states money so that the state doesn't have to have such cuts. I mean, I know that the state does have a reserve. I hope that we don't have to spend it all down, but I know in the bill that is sitting in the Senate right now, there is money for the states. So it's my job to try to help Sacramento and the cities and the counties so that they don't have to have such draconian cuts. I mean, I remember our $40 billion deficit, and I remember talk about sleepless nights, thinking of all of the cuts that we did and how we hurt people. But I remember fighting for those cuts because there was the move to dismantle programs. And I thought if we dismantled them, it would be very hard to restart versus if we cut them and they would be refunded, which they were.
Congresswoman, what you spoke earlier about the demonstrations, the racial justice demonstrations that are out here. As we've seen, and you alluded to, they are much more multiracial than they have in the past. But for this movement to keep going, it has to go beyond street demonstrations and social media postings and such, and reading how not to be an anti-racist or how to be an anti-racist. What can white people do in their daily lives specifically to be good allies to this movement?
Well, and let me just tell you, I just love seeing everybody wearing Black Lives Matters t-shirts. I do. And in some of the protests, you don't see many African Americans at all, or Latinos. And I do think that this is an issue that is beyond Black people. It is an issue that impacts Latinos, Asian Pacific Islanders, and Native Americans as well. And so one of the things that I've been saying, and I've been talking, by the way, been doing telephone town halls with my colleagues all over the place. Everybody has a police department. Look in your own backyard. Look in your own backyard. What is happening in your police department? What is happening in your school system? Is it a disproportionate suspension and expulsion rate? Say something about it, because the sad truth is it's more important for white folks to speak up about racism than it is me. Because if I speak up about racism, I'm African American. It's viewed as that's the race card. When a white person speaks up about racism, it has more legitimacy. And I think that it is so, so, so important. Sometimes I believe white folks think that they shouldn't speak about race. And I think it's exactly the opposite. The other thing is that people really need to educate themselves. And so I tell everybody to watch the Netflix documentary 13, so you can see the history of policing in America. But the average person doesn't realize that slavery lasted 256 years in the United States. And 100 years after slavery was Jim Crow and lynching. And that even in 2020, we can't pass a bill. The bill was held up in the Senate to ban lynching. So the education, but then looking in your own backyard and speaking up, it just is so, so, so helpful.
So do you think you're ready to be vice president?
I am so concerned about what's happening in this country. I'm ready and willing to do whatever. If the vice president wants me to go to the neighborhood Biden headquarters and lick stamps, if people do that anymore, or walk precincts, I just feel that the state that our country is in, domestically and internationally, requires all of us to step up and way beyond our comfort zone. So I certainly never sat back and imagined being vice president and had and have no aspirations to run for president, but I am willing to do whatever at this point in time.
I'll take that as a yes.
Yes. Well, we have an audience question. Hypothetically, Congresswoman, how would you deal with a policy disagreement with the president?
Well, the same way I would deal with a policy disagreement with Speaker Pelosi. I would say what my disagreement was. I would argue my case, and if I was not able to persuade the speaker or the president, she is the speaker. He will be the president.
What was the last policy disagreement you had with Pelosi?
The last policy disagreement I had with her actually was over the funding for COVID, but it's hard for me to describe it much as a disagreement because I took a difference to her and I said, COVID is disproportionately impacting the Black, Latino, Asian, and Native American population, and we need to have specific funding and a specific intervention. And I argued my case and she agreed.
Who's up? Oh, go ahead.
Well, I'll ask this question.
Yeah, we have. Go ahead.
Are you concerned about a backlash from ripping down statues of Columbus and Sarah and Thomas Jefferson, Ulysses Grant, that sort of thing by protesters?
I am. And well, I mean, we had the backlash, right? The president decided that he wanted to send out the troops to protect Confederate statues. I mean, this is just crazy making. I do think the statues should come down, but this is what I think we should do. Instead of ripping them down, I think there should be a process to remove those statues, and we should use it as an opportunity to educate people about who these folks were. And I also think there's a difference in statues. I don't think the Washington Monument should come down, nor do I think the Jefferson Memorial should come down. But what I do think, and this is beginning to happen now, is we need to tell the truth, the full truth about who people were. So we love the story of the cherry tree that I heard isn't even true. We like the nice stories of our history, but we don't want to hear about the fact that George Washington owned 300 human beings. We don't want to hear about Sally Hemings. Sally Hemings was 14 years old. She was a child, but we need to know that. But there are some people who tried to tear this country apart, who were traitors to the country, who tried to fight for slavery, who have no business having statues. I just want to share this with you. I work in the Capitol every day, or I did before COVID, and I know that my ancestors built that building. I know that the enslaved Americans were rented off of plantations near the Capitol. And every day I have to walk through Statuary Hall and see monuments in the form of statues to people who fought to enslave my ancestors. How do you think that makes me feel? I mean, I think that we should look at the way other countries have dealt with this issue, but what we need to do now is we need to get rid of this. And I've been so excited watching Speaker Pelosi go after it. But I really think it doesn't help much if we don't educate people at the same time. Now, you know that some of the monuments and national parks, like for example, Jefferson's home, you know, there is now a room where Sally Hemings, you know, was kept. But do you know that people go to that now and some of them are angry. They don't want to hear that. And they'll say that. I don't want to hear that part of it, but you need to, and they need to get over it. So I would like to see the statues removed, but there be an education process at the same time. But the end is removed.
Which statutes? Which statues
The
removed?
statues of the Confederate leaders.
How about Columbus, Father Sarah, those people?
No, I mean, you know, in California, we have, what's Juniper? Aren't you saying? Catholic priest, that's actually coming down, and I think it's going to be replaced by Sally Ride. But I think that a community can decide that. You know what I mean? I mean, where the statue is, and you know, that's consistent with how I've always viewed how work should be done. I think a community should decide, but I do think in terms of the Confederate statues, again, I think it's a line in the sand. Why don't we have a statue to Benedict Arnold? I mean, they were traitors. How do you have military institutions named after people that fought against the military? That just makes no sense at all.
Thank you.
When you spoke about our history, particularly of Washington and Jefferson, you did so in a very nuanced manner where you're talking about the positives and the negatives. But do you feel, and you also talk about communities coming together to make decisions, do you feel like given how polarized we are, given how, we listen to the facts that we agree with, we don't listen to the news stations we don't agree with, are you optimistic that we can actually have like those types of nuanced decisions? Like, can we reduce the amount of polarization in our society to get back to the point where we can all agree on a set of facts?
Well, yes, of course I have to be optimistic, but I am, because I see, that's another reason why I think Biden is going to be so helpful, because of his authenticity. We need healing in this country. We need somebody to bring us together. I mean, this guy has deliberately torn us apart, because as long as we're divided, then he can keep the attention focused on him and shifting away from the damage that has been done to this country. I think people want to come together. And my evidence for this is the polling in the suburbs. People, the polling says 67% of America believes the way he's handling the race is wrong. And I don't think people like this. So I do think that we can come together. There's always going to be an element, but I don't believe, I have way more faith in the American people than that.
We have an audience question about journalists. I don't think we asked that one yet, about what do you think about President Trump's repeated attacks on journalists, and how does that affect the public?
Well, it actually relates to what Seema just was talking about. I mean, now people have their own facts. What was that? There are different facts. I forget that famous quote from alternative facts. Alternative
facts, yes.
Yes, and so I feel that we need to get back to science. I mean, how about focusing on science, focusing on people who are experts on issues? But I also think that there's a part of the press that has been reduced. There's that network that people watch at night where they just outright lie to you and tell you you can take hydroxychloroquine and that, the symptoms, even if you get COVID, it's not that bad. I mean, I wonder if there's going to be a class action suit at some point to say you guys actually contributed to people getting sick and dying by deliberately lying to people and calling it news. So I think it's one of the most detrimental things that he has led around. And I think it damages democracy fundamentally. We go around the world talking about freedom of the press and all of this stuff, and then people see what is happening in our country with a leader who is just beyond disrespectful to the press, attacks the press. If he could, would arrest the press. I really do believe that. If he could figure out a way to incarcerate you guys, he'd do it.
And you were speaking of Fox News there, just to be clear, correct?
Oh, yes, sure. I was speaking of Hannity.
It could have been, there's a couple candidates there.
I'm sorry. I was speaking of Hannity, Tucker Carlson, and Laura Ingraham. How about that?
Okay, there we go. Now we got some names to it. Okay.
Chris Wallace is a journalist.
Okay.
And I think we're going to have to end on that journalism question, unfortunately. Sorry, Seema. Congresswoman, we are really grateful for your time. We know you're extraordinarily busy. Thanks to everybody who joined us on Facebook today to view our lunchtime conversation with Congresswoman Karen Bass. Thanks to Seema Mehta and George Skelton with LA Times. You can do what I've done and you can subscribe to LA Times. It's easy to do. You get it on your phone, very convenient. I'm also a subscriber to SF Chronicle, where Joe Garofoli is a senior political writer, and I just subscribed to your podcast, Joe. It's All Political.
Oh, great.
There we go. So everybody else do that right now. Thanks to Southern California Edison for making this possible. And thanks for supporting the Sacramento Press Club. We're a nonprofit. We give scholarships to aspiring journalists and student journalists. So your donation makes that possible for young people. We'll be back next week with another panel. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.